morning. I'm Jim Murphy from Grow Forward here in our offices in downtown Chicago. We're going to do another exciting interview discussion with Ellen Yiadom Hoover, who lives here in Chicago. Ellen has got a great story to tell, and we're really looking forward to having this conversation.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Jim.
Great. So you have an interesting story. I think our viewers will find very different than the average person that they might meet in the streets of Chicago. Let's start with the first days. What do you remember growing up? Where were you at, and what was your town like that you lived in?
So I was born in Accra, Ghana, which is Ghana's country in West Africa, and I grew up with my extended family. So I grew up with my parents, my grandmother, grandfather, my aunts and uncles, my cousins. So I grew up with everyone. It was like 30 people in our house, and it was a loving household. Had lots of fun, lots of freedom to run around. And unfortunately, around 5, my father passed away in a car accident. And so at that point, my uncle, who was living in the U.S. at the time in Chicago, and his wife decided to adopt me and bring me to the U.S. And so it was an interesting period. In Ghana, America is like, the promised land, the land of milk and honey. So everyone is like, it's like winning the lottery, I guess it's the equivalent. And so for me, I was thrilled as a kid. I saw the cartoons. I just thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be a wonderful experience. And I was looking very much forward to it. So that happened when I was about 7.5, when I finally came over to Chicago.
And how big was the town that you grew up in?
Well, Accra is actually the capital of Ghana.
Oh, it is.
So it's a couple of million people. And so it's a city. But my neighborhood was my world pretty much as a, 5-6-year-old, so that was relatively small. And it was a good time. We didn't have a lot, but it was a good time.
Was that your first airplane trip to come over here?
Of course, yes. And I flew by myself, actually. And remember being terrified but excited. As a kid, I think you can experience a lot of things and not really understand the depth of it, like not knowing the plane is going to crash or not knowing, something could happen to me. I just was excited about the adventure of being on a plane or going to another country. And so it was wonderful.
You had to switch planes in certain airports?
I did. So I took KLM, and so I had to switch in Zurich. And I remember being in this playground area for kids who were traveling by themselves. And it's so strange that I actually remember this very clearly, like it just happened. This was, 1991, but I remember it very clearly, and meeting kids from all over the world. It was eating food on the plane. It was neat. I loved it.
So then your new parents, your aunt and uncle, were now greeted you at the airport at O'Hare. Mm-hmm. And what was their journey like over? How long had they been here prior to your coming over?
So my uncle, my father, my adoptive father, had been here since the late 70s. My mom is American. She was born and raised in Chicago, so she'd been here all her life. And then they had a son, so I have a new brother. So I just remember them meeting me at the airport. I remember being like, wow, this is such a huge transition. I was living in a house with 30 people, and now it's just me, my new dad, my mom, and my brother. An apartment at the time. So it was like, wow, this is a much different setup than I'd been used to. But again, I was still very excited, about the new adventure.
So before I chronologically make the next step, why don't you tell us about your current situation and your family life now?
So I was out east for school, came back to Chicago a couple of years ago. So I am back in Chicago, married. I have a 2-year-old. Expecting another one on the way.
Are you really?
I live in Bronzeville. It's funny. I grew up here as a kid and experienced Chicago as a child. So I'm now experiencing it as an adult, and it's a lot of fun. And it's nice to have our family here. My parents still live in the city. My husband's family still lives he's a native Chicagoan. And so it's great to have family all around us as well, 20, 30 minutes either way. So
babysitters.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So let's go back. So now you're a kid here in Chicago, and you're gonna try to figure out what the school system is like. Mm-hmm. Your English was good, very good. Or
my English was okay. I remember. So I was 7.5 when I came. I came in August. School year started in late August, actually. I think a couple of weeks after I arrived. And so I remember there was a conversation about what grade I should go in. They were like, well, you know, it's probably better for her to go into second grade instead of third grade, because I was going to turn 8 in October, just to give her time to catch up. It's a new environment. You know, her English isn't, I had potential, but my English wasn't great. So I was placed in the lowest reading group. And I remember struggling with that, but I was really good at math. And I remember clearly doing very well on the math test, getting like 90-something%. And not really quite sure why. I don't remember doing a lot of math before coming here. It wasn't like I was being tutored in math, but it just seemed very natural to me.
Right.
And I remember thinking, wow, okay, this is something that I'm good at. I'm going to run with math. And then at some point over the years, I got moved up in the reading group and graduated as the valedictorian of that 8th grade class.
And what school was that?
St. Thomas of
Oh,
Canterbury.
that's right. So from there, what happened in your life then?
After high school?
No, before after grammar school.
After grammar school. So I got the Daniel Murphy Scholarship Fund in 8th grade, and I actually remember interviewing for that scholarship program and being very nervous. I had, I think, 3 separate interviews, and my mother did as well. So they interviewed me and then my mom, and feeling like I had to go in there and fight and be ready to explain to them why I deserve this, and being very adamant about, like this is for me. This is all the things I've done before. This is why you should give it to me. And my mom coming afterwards, and they were like, "Oh, your daughter's a powerhouse," She's like, "I know." But that was such a wonderful experience. I remember doing a program right before I started high school through the Murphy Scholarship that was really helpful. I just remember the camaraderie, the community that I found. And it was nice to have before going into high school. And I didn't know anyone in high school, so it was nice to know, hey, there's a Murphy Scholar a year ahead of me or 2 years ahead of me. And we had events as well on the weekends. The mentoring program was wonderful. My mentor, who has now passed away, became close friends with my parents. I mean, she hung out with them even after I went to college, so she really became part of our family. So
where'd you go to high school?
St. Ignatius.
Oh, that's a good school. You had a good experience there?
I had a wonderful experience. I loved it. Ignatius, just world-class education, teachers that really cared. Beautiful school. I mean, it was like going to Hogwarts. It was just a magical place. And I remember that was really the first time my parents started letting me take public transportation by myself, because I grew up in Rogers Park, but Ignatius was on what we called, I think it was just called the South Side then, but it's now the South Loop. And the neighborhood was transitioning, but my parents were like, it's time for you to be, on your own now. I was like, this is when you're gonna let me take the bus? So I remember getting up at 5:30 in the morning, taking a bus, a train, and then another bus just to get to school every morning. And being, I was excited about it, so I don't remember it really being a struggle or, complaining, especially during the winter times when it would be dark at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. But it was, I was looking forward to going to St. Ignatius. So, my mother was like, "You sure you don't want to go to St. Scholasticus right down the street?" It's like, no.
So now recapping, you got on a plane when you were 7.5 years old, flew from Ghana to Chicago, got off the plane, went to St. Thomas, and then you went to St. Ignatius and graduated there in 4 years, I assume?
In St. Ignatius, yes, of course.
And then what was the next step?
So I got into Harvard.
After St. Ignatius, you went to Harvard?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. Was there for 4 years, wonderful experience as well. Really just felt really privileged and really grateful, I guess is probably a better word, to have had that experience. I mean, it was like every day someone new was coming on campus, and it was like, oh, either do I see Kofi Annan or, Bill Clinton or some, it was just all these dignitaries coming to campus to speak, having events. It was just a world, completely beyond what I even expected. It was wonderful. I have some of my closest friends from college. It was a great experience.
Was there another education step immediately? Was there something between the next step?
So I decided to kind of pause a little bit. I was struggling to determine what my next steps were going to be. Had always wanted to be an attorney, but I was also interested in entertainment, in making films. So I was thinking about film school. so what ended up happening was I worked for a small film company on a documentary about infant mortality rates among high-achieving African-American women, which was a really interesting topic. And it kind of gave me an opportunity to see behind the scenes, like how do you put together a documentary, the editing process, interviewing process, the research process. And it was an interesting experience, but I was like, yeah, I don't know if I could do this for the rest of my life. It was hard, you just never know when the next project is going to come down the pipeline.
Right.
And funding is always an issue. And I said, well, maybe I should go to law school just in case.
So then eventually you did go back to school, though.
I did. And I think the plan was always to go back to law school, but I just needed some time to figure some things out. So I went back. So I started at UVA. Graduated 3 years later. And law school was difficult. Law school was very different from all my other educational experiences. I mean, because the idea of law school is to train you like a lawyer. So they really weren't concerned about what your thoughts were about anything. I mean, they were, but they were trying to mold you into thinking in a certain type of way that I found really difficult and unnatural for me when all my previous educational experiences had encouraged me to think outside of the box and be very creative in my thinking, and law school was not like that. So, but it was an important experience. I learned a lot. Smartest people I've ever been around.
Yeah, it's a hard school to get into. That's one of the, top 2 or 3 in the country, law schools?
Top 10, yeah,
10?
top 10. And Charlottesville was beautiful.
Yeah.
It was really just a quiet place to sit and learn, and it's a really young law school, so a lot of people either went straight through or maybe just a year off. So people were really laid back compared to other law schools, but it was still law school.
So let's recap now. We got Ghana, then we got Rogers Park, then we got St. Ignatius, Harvard, UVA.
That's right.
That's a pretty good progression.
Yep.
That's the kind of march you want to be marching on, right?
Yeah.
So you get done with law school, and then what did you decide to do?
Well, so I came out of law school during the recession,
right,
which was a very difficult time for everyone. I mean, no one was getting any sort of interviews, jobs, anything. So what happened was I summered in the summer of '09, and they came back. The firm at the time told me basically, why not take a year? And they did this to everyone in my class, and do whatever you want, volunteer, we'll pay you half your salary, and then in about a year you guys can start. So I was like, okay, that sounds like a good deal. I mean, at least I still have a job lined up in a year or two. A lot of my classmates don't. So I think I'll pursue this. So I work for a nonprofit, the Grameen Foundation. They do micro-lending in developing countries, and actually got a chance to go back to Ghana for a couple of months because they have an office there.
Had you often gone back?
Not often. I went back when I was 11. Then I went back in college, and then I think the Grameen Foundation opportunity was the third time that I'd gone back. So I was there for a couple months because of that, and then came back, started the firm finally. 4 months later, they filed for bankruptcy. Yeah. But I mean, this was the recession. This was happening all around, and so and the firm was in New York. So I moved from New York, came to Chicago. And at the time I was seeing someone, my now husband, and so I knew Chicago would eventually be where I would end up. Both of our families are here. He wanted to stay in Chicago. And so I decided to look for something here, found an opportunity at a firm, was there for a few years, and yeah.
So now you've had the experience of being at a couple firms in Chicago, but you're probably you're doing your own thing now. What do you see that transition being? Yeah,
so someone once told me to find your true passion, you have to look back at the things that you've done and the things that you've enjoyed doing. So I'm going to take a step back in answering that question. So as far back as I can remember, and I think it's part of my experience coming here as an immigrant, trying to integrate, to American society, even though I spoke English not as well, learning how to speak English, just trying to figure out who I was, right? I've always been interested in issues of inclusion and difference because I knew I was different. I spoke differently. I had a different background. I had 2 moms, biological mom. So I was keenly aware of difference from a very young age. And so I remember being involved in just intercultural programming and student groups in high school. I was president of the Black Student Association in high school. At Harvard, I was an intern for the Harvard Foundation for Intercultural Relations that brought together different student groups and had events around campus and sort of encouraged intercultural dialogue. I was president of Black Law Students Association in law school. So I looked back at all these things and I said, you know, I've always been interested in issues of inclusion, you know, and then even looking at my professional experience and seeing the importance of inclusion there. In a law firm, for example, this may be true for other industries, mentorship and just getting opportunities is essential to being successful. And what I mean by that is you need billable hours to be successful at a law firm. And in order to get those billable hours, you need partners to give you work. And partners give work to people that they trust or they like. And so a lot of that can be very subjective, right? You know, I like Bob because, you know, Bob and I can talk about sports, for example, and I feel comfortable around Bob. I have to spend hours with Bob. I'm going to give my work to Bob, right? Because at the end of the day, most of us coming from these great law schools, no one knows anything when they start. So we're all, open books. And so, but what I think what happens is there starts being a distinction between people who are getting certain work and people who are not getting certain work. And I noticed a lot of that was around difference, racial, gender lines, maybe. And so that started to inform my next steps. Okay, I've noticed, you know, there's issues with inclusion within the legal space. And this is not something that I just experienced. I mean, this is written about, researched about. Yes, the legal community has difficulties with inclusion, diversity and inclusion. And so I thought, well, maybe this is something that I can go into, something I can, use my own personal experiences to inform my next steps.
I want to just go back and recap. Ghana, Ignatius, Harvard, UVA. Law degree, a couple big firms. A lot of people would consider that a pretty successful trajectory for a first-generation immigrant from anywhere. Wouldn't you say that it was also, and did you not do it without a diversity counselor?
I think I've been given so many opportunities, and I think I've been very grateful for those opportunities. So growing up, all you have to do is work hard. You will end up having this life that is just as good as anyone, because this is a country of opportunity, and I believe that. But research shows that among college-educated folks, college-educated white Americans have 3 times the wealth of college-educated Black Americans. That blows my mind. If you're telling me that all I need to do is to get a college degree, that's the credentials, or whatever credentials, law degree, business degree, right? And the playing field is leveled. That shouldn't happen, or at least not to that degree, right? And what's happening is inheritance, basically, right? People are getting transfers of wealth that are not possible in certain communities. So for me, when I think about that, I'm like, well, gosh, so you're telling me go to school and get a degree, you're gonna do well, but just not as well because you come from a disadvantaged community. And that to me is incredible. I mean, I'm not saying this is what I'm gonna tell my 2-year-old. Like, you're gonna do well, but you may not do as well because guess what? Your grandparents don't have any inheritance to leave you, and we may not either. So, which could be, I could see you saying, oh, well, that's just your individual situation, but when the research suggests that, wait, no, actually there's a huge wealth gap, and education doesn't completely decrease that. It helps.
My position would simply be there's nothing's fair.
Oh, no.
There's no balance in anything, okay?
I agree with that.
It's opportunity, and you take the best opportunity, make the best of your situation.
I agree with that.
And that in the second generation of families should have more opportunities if the first generation took advantage of it. And then the third generation may be even better if they have a nice family unit and their people are leading them, giving them direction, okay? And their parents are telling them, you know, this is the next step. This may work out for you if you go this way, it may not. I mean, I've had children that have gone the opposite direction of what I suggested doing. So that doesn't mean just because you suggest something that's going to happen. But clearly it should be statistically an advantage to be second generation.
Oh, no, Jim, I totally agree. What I'm saying is we can't discount race, right? Or, any other sort of difference, right? And that's kind of my point. My life is certainly financially better off than my parents, of course. I earn more than my parents. My house is a nicer house than my parents' house. It's just not where I thought I would be given what the narrative was that was explained to me, right? And that's not, you can't say just because you put an A, you're gonna get B. Life doesn't work that way, right? There's all sorts of variables. And one of those variables, this has been well researched, I'm not the first one to say it, is racial difference or ethnic difference or whatever.
Well, you're the first one to say it on my little broadcast.
Oh.
So that's an important thing here. We're having this wonderful conversation about.
And that's the first step is
Yeah.
the conversation.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes people want to shy away about talking about race. And it's, and I think about people when you experience things that are traumatic, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm going to pretend like I am one for a second. You have to talk about it, right? You have to bring it to the forefront. Otherwise, it's always going to be there. And I think, with our country, there's lots of protests, there's a lot going on, but no one's really having these conversations about difference and inclusion, right?
Right.
What research or thinking suggests is, okay, you go to these schools, you should be able to live anywhere you want. Okay, I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and there's nothing wrong with that. But to me, that is strange because you would have thought all these opportunities would have afforded me the opportunity to have access, greater, and it has to a certain extent, but not as great, I think, as my colleague and some of my friends. Again, I think research bears this out, but that's just been my personal experience. It's not to say that I don't believe in opportunity or hard work.
Right.
I believe in working extremely hard.
Right.
In fact, had I known this, I would have worked harder. To be honest, I would have, because I would have seen fully sort of the obstacles and the barriers that are before me. But I didn't know this as a kid.
You just said that when they're of age.
Oh yeah.
So we have racial discrimination, but we also have there's gender diversity that you talked about. Some of our viewers will be able to put a time on this interview based on my next question, because it was just yesterday or the day before the state of California passed a law that said that every board has to have a woman on the board of directors for privately and publicly traded companies. My question to you is, do you think a law like this improves gender equality, or does it, is it a positive or is it a negative? And do you see it helping, or do you see a possible backlash by having a law needed in order to do this, which is probably already happening in California? You have to think it's probably already pretty widespread. Do they need a law?
I think a law can help. I think, first of all, businesses have what we call the business case for diversity, right? As this country grows increasingly more diverse, businesses have to be able to respond to that, right? Their markets are changing. What does the market look like? Right? For example, Walmart, who are the consumers? That's changed over the years, right? Especially with increased immigration. And so it's important to be responsive for that.
That's smart business.
Mm-hmm. That's smart business.
You're just citing a smart business case for
Exactly.
having a diverse board.
Right.
Okay, because that diverse board would bring talents and experiences and things that other people, that if you had an all-white male board, wouldn't have. Okay, that's business. Do you need a law to do it?
Well, I think you do. When I think back on Brown versus Board of Education, many people said the country wasn't ready for integrated schools, right? And so, and a lot of people talk about this, well, maybe it was important for the Supreme Court to make that decision to get the country ready. So maybe the Supreme Court was a little bit ahead of the country. I think in certain cases it does help. It does help to push people forward, put a little bit of fire under them that they wouldn't otherwise, to make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. So yeah, I think sometimes that does work, but ultimately I think as a country we have to come to the decision that this is something that's important for us. We have all these ideals as a shining nation on a hill, and yet we're not completely living up to that, and that should concern all of us.
Companies that discriminate at that level end up probably not being that smart. Okay, And I just
Well, oftentimes people talk about the business case for diversity. Within
Right.
the legal industry, we say, well, companies are looking for outside counsel law firms that are diverse because they themselves are diverse. Their clients are diverse, and so there's different programs like requiring a certain percentage of people of color or minorities working on certain cases. For example, Facebook requires a certain percentage of the people working on their matters to be people of color or women. So that's for law firms. That's their business case. If we want Facebook's business, we need to do X, Y, and Z. So for them, it makes real good business sense. But I think it's also important to look beyond that. There's this additional element of, who are we? And I understand the country's segregated, people socialize around, racial lines. And I mean, I know people have said outside of work, they may never see a person of color, depending on where they live and who's in their family. And I think that's problematic. I think, why live in such a diverse country, but not really experience it, not really have true inclusion?
But people could freely choose not to. It could be
They
religious
could.
grounds. It could
It
could be all kinds of different grounds.
They could, and they do.
Cub
but
fans don't like talking to Sox fans. It's really
Yeah.
people can choose to do that freely in a free
Mm-hmm.
society. And unfortunately, if we restrict it, should we have a law that every religion should be represented on a company board?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't think it makes good policy. But diversity, both gender and racial, is coming. The evolution is happening. It's almost revolutionary, but it's happening.
Diversity is happening.
It's
Inclusion
happening.
is a bit more of a struggle, I think. It's having everyone being, and I understand, that's years off maybe, right? There's a lot of reasons why things are, there's housing segregation. You can explain why the city
We
looks the
still
way it
have
does.
public school segregation here in Chicago.
Yeah.
It's amazing. We still have it. You have schools that are just 99% African American.
Yes.
You got schools that are mostly white, not
Yeah.
99, but you got schools that are probably 75. And yet we've had Supreme Court decisions that said we shouldn't do it that way. Right? What is that all about?
Yeah.
We can't even fix the school system.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. It's difficult. Like, these are not easy solutions, right? This is not something that happened overnight. It took centuries for us to get to this point.
Right.
And it's going to take some more time for us to move beyond it. But it's not to say that we don't address it or we don't tackle it, that we don't engage it. And, it might take, even after engaging, it might take still some centuries. I don't know.
Not centuries.
Well, hopefully not. Well,
Not
the gap,
centuries.
the gap in wealth, they said it might take 200 years for that to close. And this is among college-educated folks, which I think is crazy, right? That's, beyond my lifetime, obviously. So, but again, it's not to say that we don't engage it or we don't think it's important or it's not worth talking about. I think that's the important part.
Well, that'd be an exciting project. You have your own firm, do that kind of advisory work. I think it probably is a field that you can go beyond law firms.
Oh, yes,
You
definitely.
don't have to be doing...
Law firms struggle a lot with it,
Right.
and I think it's because of the way the billable hours situation is structured. But other companies are talking a lot about it, especially in the tech industry. Facebook has done a lot with it, for example. So, yeah, I know it's... schools are talking about it now, doing more with that, universities. So, yeah, no, you can go beyond just law firms.
If you're successful, you put yourself out of business.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's the goal, right? Like, that I don't need to do this because
Right.
people get it and people want to talk about it and
Right.
people are not rolling their eyes when I talk about it. So, yeah.
I think we could end with that. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.